She didn't even look up when I walked in. That's the part I keep coming back to. I'd driven 40 minutes in the rain, brought the wine she specifically requested, and my sister-in-law just kept scrolling her phone like I was a delivery driver she'd already tipped. I set the bottle on her counter. She said, "Thanks." To no one in particular. "My name is Rachel. I'm 31. I run a small accounting firm I built from scratch after 6 years of 70-hour weeks. And for the better part of 3 years, I told myself that my sister-in-law's coldness was just her personality. That some people were built that way. That family required patience the same way it required showing up in the rain with wine you didn't pick. I told myself a lot of things back then. I had a talent for it. Her name is Diane. She's 2 years older than my husband, David, which she carries like a credential. She speaks in the tone of someone who has always been right about everything and is simply waiting for the rest of the room to catch up. She's charming when she needs something. She's forgettable when she doesn't. I used to think that was just confidence. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to understand it was something else entirely. David and I had been married for 4 years when the first request came. It arrived the way all of Diane's requests did, not directly, not to me, but through my husband at dinner, framed as a casual update rather than an ask. Diane was opening a boutique. Small thing, curated goods. She'd always had an eye for aesthetics, you know how she is. She just needed someone to co-sign the commercial lease. Landlords were difficult. Her credit had a gap from a freelance period. It would only be on paper. Nothing would ever come back to me. That last sentence. I've thought about it many times since. David said it gently, the way he said most things involving his sister, with a softness that was either love or avoidance, and I was never fully certain which. I asked how long the lease was. 3 years, he said. I asked if Diane had a business plan. He said she had a vision. I asked what the difference was, and the table got quiet in that specific way that meant I'd said something technically correct but socially inconvenient. I didn't co-sign. Not that night. What I did was offer something else. I told David I'd help Diane review the numbers, look over the lease terms, walk her through what lenders look for. I was an accountant. This was literally what I did. I could give her something more valuable than my name on a document. I could give her a foundation that actually worked. Diane's response, relayed through David the following morning. That's sweet, but she already has people for that. She didn't have people for that. She had a friend who'd once worked at a bank and a brother who wanted everyone to get along. I signed the lease 6 weeks later. I want to be honest about how that happened because I've seen versions of this story where the woman is passive, where things are done to her and she simply endures. That's not quite right. I made a choice. I made it with incomplete information, under consistent low-grade pressure, in a marriage where keeping the peace had become something I confused with keeping things good. Those are different. I understand that now. The boutique opened. It was beautiful. Genuinely, Diane had an eye. That part was true. Linen, everything. Handmade ceramics. Candles that smelled like money. For about 6 months, I let myself believe I'd worried for nothing. Then the landlord called my cell phone. I didn't recognize the number. I answered, because I answer numbers I don't recognize. That's the professional habit of someone who expects important calls. The voice on the other end was polite, businesslike, mildly confused. He was following up on the November payment. He'd tried the primary account holder twice, without response. Since I was listed on the lease, he wanted to make sure there wasn't a miscommunication. I stood in my office parking lot for a moment after he said that. November. It was November 14th. I told him I'd look into it and call back within the hour. I used my professional voice, the one that sounds like everything is under control, because in my line of work, clients need to believe that even when it isn't true. Then I called Diane. She answered on the 4th ring. Voice light, slightly distracted. When I asked about the rent, she said she'd been meaning to reach out. Things had been tight this month. She was waiting on an invoice from a wholesale vendor. It would absolutely be sorted by end of week. I asked which end of week, specifically. She paused. Then she said she didn't appreciate the tone. I want to describe what happened inside me at that moment, because it mattered. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something quieter and more clarifying, like a frequency I'd been vaguely hearing for years finally resolved into a distinct sound. I had been on that lease for 11 months. I had never once been copied on a payment confirmation, included in a financial update, or asked if I wanted to stay informed. My name was useful when it opened the door. After that, I had become invisible on purpose. I paid the November rent. I told the landlord I'd handle future communications directly and asked him to contact me if any payment was more than 3 days late. That evening, I told David what had happened. He listened carefully, which I appreciated. Then he said Diane was going through a difficult stretch, that the boutique was finding its footing, that it would be cruel to make a big thing out of one late payment when she was already stressed. One late payment. I nodded. I said that made sense. I went to bed early and lay there in the dark doing what I did best, running numbers, backward and forward, until the picture was clear. 11 months of lease. My name, my credit, my liability. 0 communication. 1 missed payment I only discovered by accident. I got up at midnight and opened my laptop. I wasn't looking for trouble. I want to be clear about that. I was looking for information, which is different, though Diane would later describe it as snooping, as paranoia, as the behavior of a woman who didn't trust family. I've learned that when someone calls your reasonable caution by unreasonable names, that's useful data. What I found was not dramatic in the way people expect drama to look. There was no single smoking gun, no moment of gasping revelation. It was smaller than that. It was a pattern. Diane's boutique had my name on the lease. It also had my name without my knowledge on a secondary business account she'd opened to manage vendor payments. The account required a guarantor with a verifiable income above a certain threshold. She had listed me. She had not told me. I found this because the bank had sent a letter to our house, addressed to me, which David had left on the kitchen counter under a magazine for what appeared to be 2 weeks. I read it twice. Then I sat with it for a long time. The letter wasn't a collection notice. It was a routine notification, an update to account terms, the kind of thing banks send periodically that most people delete without reading. If David had handed it to me immediately, if I hadn't happened to move the magazine, I would never have known the account existed. That's what got me. Not the action itself, though the action was serious. What got me was how easily I was supposed to not notice. How the whole arrangement depended on my being exactly as incurious as they'd assumed I was. I am an accountant. Incurious is the one thing I have never been. I didn't confront anyone that night. I didn't forward the letter to David with a row of question marks. I didn't call Diane. I took a photograph of the letter, put it back under the magazine at exactly the same angle, and went to bed. Calm doesn't come from not feeling things. It comes from deciding what to do with what you feel. The annual family dinner was 3 weeks later. David's family did this every December. His parents, Diane, a rotating collection of cousins and neighbors his mother described as practically family, which in practice meant people who would witness things. His mother, Joan, was a woman who loved an audience. She set a beautiful table. She made sure everyone knew she'd set a beautiful table. She had spent 30 years organizing her world so that gratitude flowed toward her, and she was good at it. I arrived with David. I wore something simple. I smiled at the right moments. I helped carry dishes from the kitchen because that was what I always did, and I had not yet decided to stop doing the things I always did. Not yet. Midway through the main course, Joan raised her glass. This happened sometimes a toast, a moment of warmth, something that looked like appreciation. I had learned not to expect my name to appear in these toasts. I was David's wife. That was the role. But this time Joan said my name. She said it warmly, with a kind of smile that makes a room lean in. She said she wanted to acknowledge how much support I'd given Diane's business, what a blessing it was to have a daughter-in-law with such practical skills, how the boutique was thriving because of the stability I'd helped provide. She said, and I remember this exactly, because I have replayed it many times, she said, some people give family their time. Rachel gives them the real kind of support, the kind that costs something. Laughter. Genuine, warm laughter. David touched my shoulder. Diane smiled into her wine glass without meeting my eyes. My father-in-law nodded, like he was watching something get correctly filed. I looked around the table. Everyone was pleased. Everyone was satisfied. I had just been publicly credited for something I had not agreed to, framed as generosity I had not offered, in terms that made any future objection look like ingratitude. It was elegant. I'll give her that. I lifted my glass. I waited for the room to settle. Thank you, I said. Though I'd love to get everyone aligned on the details soon. Good support works best when it's built on accurate paperwork. I'll be following up this week. The table didn't freeze the way it does in stories. It was more subtle than that. A few people smiled politely without quite knowing what they were smiling at. Joan tilted her head a fraction of an inch. Diane set her wine glass down. David said my name quietly, in the register he used when he wanted me to stop. I took a sip and looked at the centerpiece. On the drive home, he said I'd made it weird. Not hostile, not deceptive, weird. I looked at the city lights the way you look at something when you're not really seeing it, when you're somewhere else entirely, making decisions. I said, I know. He said Diane was under a lot of pressure. I said, I know that too. He said his mother had meant it as a compliment. I said, I understand what she meant it as. There was a long silence after that. The kind that arrives when someone realizes you're not going to argue, which is more unsettling than arguing, because argument means there's still something to negotiate. That night, I made a list. Not an emotional list, not grievances and feelings, those are real, but they don't hold up. A factual list. The lease, the terms, my liability exposure, the secondary account, the missed payment I'd covered, the total financial risk sitting under my name without my active consent. The number was larger than I'd expected. When you're absorbing things gradually, you don't notice the accumulation. You only see it clearly when you put it all in one column. I scheduled a meeting with my own attorney for that Friday, not to sue anyone, not to blow anything up. I went because I needed someone to explain to me, in precise terms, exactly what I was liable for and what my options were. That's what professionals are for. What my attorney told me was calm and clarifying. My exposure was real, my options were clear, and the secondary account listing was something I had legal standing to address directly with the bank given I had never signed consent documentation. I thanked her. I went home. I started drafting an email. One email. Polite, specific, completely unemotional. I outlined what I had discovered, what I was taking steps to correct, and what future arrangements would require from everyone involved. No accusations. No history. No mention of the dinner, the toast, the years of being treated like a financial instrument with good manners. Just facts. Facts don't need volume to be heard. I sent it Sunday evening. By Monday morning, my phone had 4 missed calls from Diane, 2 from Joan, and 1 from a number I didn't recognize that turned out to be Diane's accountant, which told me a great deal about how seriously the email had been taken. I didn't call anyone back that day. I went to the bank and submitted the documentation my attorney had advised. The Secondary Account Association was flagged for review. I contacted the landlord again and requested that all future correspondence be directed to me first, citing my primary lease status. I made every call in my professional voice, the same voice I used with clients whose books were a disaster and who needed someone steady telling them what came next. David found out that evening when Diane called him crying. He came home with that particular expression he wore when the world had required him to have a feeling before he was ready. He sat down across from me and said, Rachel, what did you do? I said, I corrected some paperwork. He said, you went to a lawyer. I said, I got information. That's different from going to war. He said Diane was panicking. He said his mother was upset. He said the business account issue was probably just a mistake, an oversight, that Diane hadn't meant to create a problem. I let him finish. I said, I believe she didn't mean for it to become a problem. I also believe that's different from it not being a problem. He was quiet for a moment. I said, your name isn't on any of this. Mine is. When someone calls about a missed payment, they call me. When there's a liability, it's mine. I am the only one in this family who has something to lose here, and I've been the only one not fully informed. That ends now. He said, you could have talked to me first. I said, I did talk to you. In November. You said it was one late payment. He didn't have an answer for that. He went to the kitchen and made coffee, and we didn't discuss it again that night. But something had shifted, I could feel it. Not in a dramatic, door-slamming way. In the quieter way things shift when someone realizes you've been measuring things they thought you weren't measuring. The response from Diane came 48 hours later. It was long, emotional, and structured entirely around her perspective, her stress, her vision, her assumption that family helped each other without making it transactional. The word transactional appeared 3 times, I counted. She said she'd always assumed I was on board. She said Joan had assumed the same. She said if I had questions I should have asked months ago rather than ambushing everyone with lawyers and paperwork. I read it once, completely, and then wrote back in 3 sentences. I said I understood her position. I said that going forward all arrangements involving my name or credit would require my written consent in advance. I said I was available to discuss lease renewal options when she was ready. I didn't address the word transactional. It didn't require a response. Joan called me directly for the first time in our entire relationship. Not through David, not framed as a family dinner topic. She called my cell on a Tuesday afternoon, and when I answered, she said, in the warm tone she used when she needed something, "Rachel, darling, I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot here." I said, "I don't think we have. I think we're exactly where things were always headed once I started paying attention." Silence. She said, "That's not a very generous reading of the situation." I said, "I'm an accountant. I read situations accurately, not generously. The two aren't the same." She said she hoped I understood what I was doing to the family. I said I hoped she understood what the family had been doing to me. The call ended shortly after that. Here's what happened next, and why it matters. Diane didn't fight the bank correction. She didn't threaten to tell people I was difficult, cold, ungrateful, or if she did it quietly, to the people who would have believed it anyway. What she did was go back to the landlord and begin the process of removing me from the lease entirely, which required her to qualify independently. She couldn't qualify independently. Her credit, as it turned out, had not improved during the period she'd been leaning on mine. The boutique's lease came up for renewal 4 months later. Without my name on it, and without the business account guarantee. She had to negotiate new terms. The landlord offered them at a higher rate, with a larger deposit, standard for a business without a strong credit anchor. The margin she'd been operating on, already thin, became thinner. I did not feel satisfaction about this in the way I expected to. What I felt was cleaner than satisfaction. I felt like a room after the windows have been opened. David and I had the real conversation about 2 months after all of it. The one where we weren't talking about lease terms, or phone calls, or who said what at dinner. We were talking about us, what the last few years had actually looked like, what he'd been choosing not to see, whether the peace he'd been keeping was peace at all or just a postponement. He said he hadn't realized how much I'd been absorbing. I said I hadn't let him realize. That was on me too. He said he'd thought managing his family was protecting me. I said managing them on my behalf, without telling me, had the same effect as the problem he thought he was solving. I wasn't fragile. I was uninformed. Those are different. We sat with that for a long time. David is a good man in the specific way that some good men are frustrating. He has genuine care and genuine blind spots, and for years the care made me work around the blind spots instead of asking him to address them. That was something we both had to look at honestly. We're still looking at it. That's where we are. It isn't a clean ending. I won't pretend otherwise, because the people reading this deserve honesty more than they deserve a tidy bow. What I can tell you is that my name is no longer on anything I didn't choose. That every financial arrangement in my life now has documentation I reviewed before signing. That when someone in my husband's family asks for something that involves my resources, my credit, or my professional standing, the conversation happens with me directly, not through him, not over dinner, not in the subtext of a toast that everyone applauds before I've agreed to anything. That sounds like a small thing. I know it sounds like a small thing. But I spent 3 years being practically included in decisions that were actually being made without me. I spent 3 years being thanked publicly for things I hadn't offered. I spent 3 years mistaking the absence of conflict for the presence of respect. They are not the same thing. I want to be very specific about that for anyone who needs to hear it. Diane's boutique is still open. She found a different solution, a business partner, someone willing to share both the credit exposure and the liability. I heard about this through David's mother, who mentioned it in passing as though it were a natural evolution rather than the direct result of my name no longer being available as a structural support. I smiled and said that sounded like a solid arrangement. Joan looked at me for a moment longer than necessary. Then she said yes, it was working out well. And that was that. No confrontation. No apology. No acknowledgement of anything that had happened. Just a family that had quietly restructured around the fact that I had quietly restructured first. The last thing I'll say is about silence, because it's the thing I keep returning to. I was silent for 3 years in the way that felt like grace, but was actually erosion. Every time I didn't ask about the lease terms, every time I absorbed a late payment without a direct conversation, every time I nodded at a dinner toast that publicly defined me in terms I hadn't agreed to, I thought I was being mature. I thought I was choosing peace. What I was actually doing was teaching everyone around me what I would accept. People learn what you accept. They learn it faster than anything else. My silence had been read as permission. So I took it back, not loudly. Not in a way that required anyone to apologize or anyone to cry or anyone to admit what they'd done in the careful specific words I deserved. I took it back through documentation, through clear language, through the simple practice of requiring my actual consent for my actual life. That turns out to be enough. You don't need the dramatic conversation. You don't need them to understand what they did. You just need to change what you allow. Trust reveals itself under pressure. Loyalty reveals itself when it costs something. And silence, I finally learned, is never neutral. It always belongs to someone. I just needed to decide that someone was going to be me.